All right, we're going to get started now. We're going to move into our introduction to local governments in California. We've talked a lot about who we're serving and some of the reasons why we're serving, and we thought it might be helpful to spend a bit of time, and we're going to spend the next hour and a half or so talking about local governments, what kinds of organizations they are, how they function, how they interact with each other. And for this portion, I'm going to be sharing the stage with Jenny Woods, who is both an LGC project manager and a planner, as well as one of our regional supervisors for the Sacramento team. So Jenny, I'm going to unmute you now and turn it over to you in just a second. Can you hear us?
I can hear you guys. Can you hear me?
I can indeed. You sound great.
Okay. Loud
So
enough?
just let me know when you want to advance the slides.
Okay, perfect. So as Kip mentioned, I'm Jenny Woods. I'm a project manager for the Local Government Commission. I'm really excited to be involved with CivicSpark, and I'm excited to be here in Sacramento, getting to know all the members here, and hopefully in my travels through my other projects, maybe I'll get to meet some of the other members throughout the state. So I'm here today just to kind of give you an introduction to local governments in California, because it's a little bit convoluted. There's a lot of different types of local governments in the state, and especially for people that are moving from outside the state, things might work a little bit differently than they do in California. So it's pretty basic. Again, it's high level, as Kif and Kristen mentioned. This is just the tip of the iceberg for the orientation and high level. So if you can go to the next slide. So we've kind of broken it up. There's into three different categories. So in municipalities, we'll be talking about kind of cities and towns and counties and schools. In terms of regional agencies, there's metropolitan planning agencies, there's regional transportation planning agencies, and there's councils of governments. And they kind of all overlap and sometimes and do different things, do the same thing. And then in other areas, there's the municipal utilities, there's special districts, there's LAPCOs, and then there's joint power authorities. So I'm just going to kind of, for the next little bit, we're going to kind of go through each of these and what they are, what they do, and some of their differences and similarities. Next. So in California, there's over 7,000 local government agencies. So there is a ton. And through that, we elect about 15,000 people to oversee these agencies. So a lot of the local governments obviously have elected officials, but then some of the other special districts and joint power authorities have boards that they elect to kind of run the activities of those organizations. And in a lot of cases, I mentioned, they have overlapping and sometimes conflicting duties and responsibilities. So it can get a little confusing and hard to keep track of who does what, when, where. Next. So starting off at kind of the lowest level are cities. There's about 482 incorporated cities in California. And there's generally two types of cities. There's general law cities, and then there's charter cities. So most cities are general law cities. Their powers are defined by the state constitution and government codes. But then there's also charter cities, and they may have increased powers, but their adoption and amendment requires a popular vote of the citizens there. So there's a mix. There's also differences in cities between a council manager style of government as well as a strong mayor form of government. So most cities are council manager, where there's the council that is elected, and then there's the city manager that supervises the operations of the city. So, and then some of the larger cities mostly have a strong mayor form of government. So San Diego is an example of that. And in that case, the council or the city manager has less power, and the mayor would bring the budget up to the vote. They provide a number of municipal services: police, fire, street maintenance, recreation, waste, things like that. But probably one of the things that makes them most unique and why we work with them so often is because they have the land use authority in the state. through their general plans, their building codes, their zoning ordinances. So this brings them a lot of power, and is, as Holly and Ken and Tiff probably mentioned in the past, why the state really needs to look to them to make changes and make progress around climate change, because they do have this land use authority. Next. And so then there's also counties. There's 58 counties in California. They're usually governed by a board of supervisors. The counties are more state defined, and they really lack the power, a lot of the powers that cities have. And more of what they do is identified by the state. So they do a lot of the jails, elections, public health care, foster care, stuff like that. So that's probably basically the thing, and there's usually multiple cities within a county. Next. So part of the state wants to also make sure that there aren't too many cities within the state. So there are local agency formation commissions, and they're political subdivisions of the state, and they kind of oversee the regional growth management and the formation and development of new local government agencies. They oversee cities and some types of special districts. They don't oversee things like joint power authorities or air districts, college districts. They're more focused on kind of the land use perspective, and you know, college districts, it's not quite as much of a connection. Next. There's also joint powers authorities. So basically, joint powers is a term that's used to describe when two or more government agencies agree to come together and combine their powers and resources to work on a common goal, project, measure, activity. And really the idea behind it is to achieve that economy of scale and save their time and money. So basically, the joint power authority can have any authority or power that is common to the member agencies. So they can't create a new power or do something new. It has to be something that's coming from the member agencies, and then it's outlined by the joint power agreement. And you know, examples are like the Capital Corridor, so the train. We work really closely often with the Bay Area Joint Policy Committee to do work around that. If you go next, there's also, I put a number of different examples of what joint power authorities do. They huge range, anything from mental health to airport expansions, redevelopment, waste, anything where local governments have identified it makes more sense to pull together to do this work. So as I mentioned, the Bay Area Joint Policy Committee is located in the Bay Area, and it tries to coordinate their planning efforts of the Association of Bay Area Governments, the air quality districts there, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. So they specifically focus on adaptation issues, regional economic development work, renewable energy, and then they also work together on their sustainable community strategy, which we'll be talking about in just a little bit. Next. Excuse me. Another form of local government is special districts. So they are a form of local government created by a local community to meet a specific need. And a lot of special districts have really been created and have become more popular as it's harder for local governments to pay for specific services that the local community may want. So it's really out of a response of kind of economic challenges in a lot of cases. And there has been just a proliferation of them. So there's over 2,300 in California. They're often governed by an independent board of directors, or they can be appointed by the city council or board of supervisors. They can get funding in two different ways. They can either charge customers for a service, so that could be more something related to water if they're providing water. Or if it's not something where you can really, it's more like a service to give and then get money in return, you can get funding through property taxes to cover costs. They can also sometimes issue general obligation or revenue bonds to pay for specific activities or efforts that they may want to do. So if we go to the next slide, I shared a few different examples of special districts. So most special districts perform only one function, but there are special districts that perform more than one function, like community service districts. So again, similar to kind of joint power authorities, they take on things like, libraries and waste and water, utilities, different activities such as that. Next. Also, school districts. They're a form of a special purpose district. They're governed by school boards. They are voted on by the local community, and what's important to recognize is they are completely different from the city. So, when I was talking about this presentation with Tiff, I was sharing how it's funny when you see in like TV shows or movies when a city council person says, I'm going to fix schools and I'm going to do everything for the schools. Well, they really don't have all the power. The school board members are really the ones that make the decisions about schools and new schools, how the school curriculum works. So they're pretty separate, and that can sometimes create tension about, if you think about land use planning and where schools are located versus how the community is planning and how that kind of plays together. So there's really interesting land use things that come up when you're thinking about those relationships and how they interact with one another.
And Jenny, if I can hop in, this has always been one for me, as we talked about the other day, where it really illuminated the complexity of local governments, because not only can a city not tell a school what to do, often they really don't talk to each other at all. And we as residents or people who live and work in a community, we think of this network of services as all being of one thing, but they actually belong to different entities who have very different structures, reporting dynamics, and it can create a lot of confusion for the average person. For example, you might have a road that's owned by a county running through a town, or a state road running through there, and who controls, who does the upgrades, or you might have a municipal utility who owns some of the lights and another, but the city owns the other ones, or the school owns some public space that seems like a community center, but it's not the city's. This goes on and on through your special districts, and yet as a resident, it's just your home. And so trying to untangle how those all fit together can be really important to getting things done.
Yeah, thanks, Kif. I think that's well put. So just things to keep in mind as you're working with, a lot of you will be doing a lot of outreach work, and a lot of local government or a lot of citizens don't understand necessarily the difference between special districts and school districts and joint power authorities. It's hard to keep track of. So helping them understand if those issues come up. Next. So now I'm moving on to more of the regional entities that are involved. And the first one are their Council of Governments, and they're governed by local elected officials within a given region. And they're often created through a JPA. And they engage in a variety of different planning and program implementation efforts. So, and not all of them are the same. Some have stronger focuses on certain issues than others, but they'll often, transportation is a big one that they often work on together. Housing, economy, energy, environment, any of those things that are kind of benefit from collaboration and coordination and consensus across a region rather than focusing on just transportation in your region. Because really, if you think about it, things like transportation are very regional. They're not, you're going to be much more successful if you collaborate and coordinate with other local governments within your region than trying to just plan your transportation needs on your own. So examples of Council of Governments that you may have heard of are, Western Riverside Council of Governments, Fresno Council of Governments. They're really throughout the state. But then this is where it gets messy if you move on to the next slide. There's metropolitan planning organizations. So Council of Governments is a choice. Regions can choose to come together and create these Council of Governments. But metropolitan planning organizations are federally mandated and funded, and they are in charge of doing the transportation planning within a given region. So they receive transportation funds from the federal government, and they're in charge of expending those funds based upon a continuing cooperative and comprehensive planning process. And really, these are only for certain urbanized areas. So one example is the Tahoe Metropolitan Planning Organization. Again, similar to COGS, they're made up of representatives from local government and government transportation authorities. And in a lot of cases, the COGS ends up serving the role of the Metropolitan Planning Organization. So rather than having a COG and an MPO, the COG would just take on that role. So for example, in the Sacramento region, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, they also serve as the MPO and help, make the planning decisions there. So if we go to the next slide, I know this is a small map, but it kind of gives you an idea of the relationship and what exists in California. Another thing that I forgot to mention, which I don't have a slide about, is regional transportation planning agencies. Those are a state requirement to do state transportation planning. So it's another level. And again, in a lot of places, the COG will take on that role as the RTPA as well. So, if you can look here, the ones with the slashes, there's an RTPA within an MPO. The lighter green ones, they're non-MPO rural RTPA areas. So those are ones that they're small enough, rural enough, where the federal government doesn't require them to have an MPO. And then in some cases, there's single county MPOs. So for example, the SACOG region covers the 6-county region. So they're the MPO for 6 counties. But in other areas, such as like Kern Council of Governments, they're a single county MPO. So they only do the transportation planning for that single county. So again, lots of different players, and especially those 3, the Council of Governments, the Metropolitan Planning Organizations, and the RTPAs have a lot of overlap, and in a lot of cases, they are just one entity. But you'll hear those phrases, MPO, COGS, come up a lot. A lot of you are working for COGS or MPOs. So, it's good to gain an understanding of the differences and similarities. Next slide. So now that we've kind of gone over some of the different types of local governments that exist in California, I wanted to dive a little bit more into local government land use authority, because it really is so unique and about cities and is so critical to the work that we conduct. So in most cases, planning decisions require local political approval, and we hope would reflect the desires and interests of the community. And so in most cases, local governments have a planning commission to make land use decisions. In some cases, just the city council will make them, but again, most have a planning commission. Next. And really, there's 3 basic tools of local planning. There are the general plans, which you can really think about as the long-term blueprint for development. In other states, these are known as master plans or comprehensive plans. They're very policy-oriented. And I'll go a little bit more in depth on the next page about what's included in general plans, because they are really the blueprint for your community. A lot of you will probably be diving into these, and we'll see a few throughout the year. And during some of the orientation trainings, you'll have an opportunity to look at general plans and kind of get to know those. There's also zoning ordinances, or the development code. And these are really designed to translate what the policy that's in the general plan into specific requirements for landowners. So really telling them, for this specific plot of land, what you can build, how you can build it, and things like that. And then there's also the subdivision regulations. And this really is more of like a state mandate, which requires local governments to consider the subdivision of the land and how that's going to look and work, and making sure, you know, there's enough resources when you're adding, when you're subdividing the land. So just to go a little bit more in depth into general plans on the next slide, this is something that's mandated by the state of California, that local governments have to create these, and it has to contain 7 elements. So land use, circulation, housing, conservation, open space, noise, and safety. In a lot of cases, local governments go above and beyond that and have a number of other elements. And those are examples of those are listed on the right side of this slide. Another common thing to incorporate into the general plans nowadays is adaptation or climate adaptation, climate action plans. In some cases, they're separate from the general plan, but a lot of local governments are now moving into incorporating it into the general plan, either as an additional element or chapter or incorporating it throughout the general plan. These 7 elements are not set in stone. The legislature can amend the law to add or subtract required elements, but that hasn't happened since the 80s, so it is really rare. And as Holly may have mentioned, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research is really in charge of supporting local governments in the development of their general plans. So they have a number of resources. They have general plan guidelines for the local governments that they can utilize as they're updating their general plans. And they're actually in the process of updating those guidelines now, and they're going to be available really soon. And they're also doing a new tool to support along with these general plan guidelines. And in a couple months, when it's ready to go, we'll probably have a training so you guys can see the general plan guidelines and learn more about them, and then learn more about the tools that they're creating to help local governments create these plans. On to the next slide. But even though local governments have a ton of land use authority and really it comes down to them, they really don't have all the say. And it's a really good reminder to remember all the different players involved in land use decision making. So anything from the judges who may take up court cases about eviction, things like that, or the state legislature who passes new laws or can require local governments to consider a new element or consider a new concept when they're writing their general plans, such as more recently they required local governments to consider environmental justice in their general plans. Then there's the various governmental agencies. So the state legislature has passed things such as the Coastal Act, which requires special planning processes for coastal areas and creates the California Coastal Commission to oversee coastal planning. So even though, you know, the local governments have the land use authority, they still have to work with the Coastal Commission when they live near the coast. There's also Congress who passes laws. There's the Supreme Court who has had a number of really famous cases about planning over the years. Then there's the private companies and marketplaces. So, you know, local governments can do and say and build what they want, but they also have to be able to respond to the private companies who are probably going to build these things, and whether those private companies think the marketplace will bear it or utilize the resources. And then you have to think about the private citizens and the engagement around what they want and what they need in their communities. So it's, as you're working in these communities and dealing with these planning issues, it's a good reminder to remember all the different players involved and all the different laws and regulations and all that goes into it, because there's a lot going on. And then the next 2 slides, if you move forward, just kind of show some of those milestones in California planning law. And I'm not going to go through it, but I did think it was just kind of interesting to share. I found as I was doing some of the research putting this together, it does kind of show all the different players involved and all the different aspects of it. So anything from the first subdivision map in 1907, different, the housing element that was then required in 1967. If you go on to the next slide, in 1973, OPR issued their first guidelines for general plan. In 1975, the legislature did something. So I thought this was a fun way to show all the different players. The California Supreme Court made decisions about zoning, things like that. On to the next slide. So needless to say, with all these players, land use authority and planning can be challenging, and there's a lot of ongoing issues related to it that I thought would be important for you guys to keep in mind as you're working at the local level. So planning has always been political. It is political. A lot of the local planners, they need to stay non-political, but really when it comes down to it, it comes down to a vote in a lot of cases. And it's really become even more political over time. There's the politics of proximity, not in my backyard, you may have heard NIMBYs, so that causes a lot of challenges of, topics such as where do you put affordable housing becomes very challenging, and sometimes citizens don't want affordable housing near them, things like that. Single issue politics is another reason that it's become more challenging over time. Things, have become more polarized, so it can make it difficult to get people to compromise on things like land use issues, especially because people can be so sensitive about land use. And then, there's just heightened political awareness. There's more engagement from citizen groups that have really come together around these issues, from developers that are really engaged in the process. So again, it's always important to remember that planning is political. Also, there's a lot of, there's ongoing state, local fiscal crisis. As you know, that we've been through a recession. It's caused a lot of challenges for local governments. And one of the, as Kif mentioned, one of the reasons that we're providing this capacity building program is because, in part because of their fiscal crises. And there's been a lot of things that have happened over time that have led to heightened and more challenged local fiscal crisis. So example of Prop 13, which for people that are from California, and if you guys studied planning, you probably heard of Prop 13, which put constraints on levying property taxes and how much property taxes could be levied by a local government. And that, local governments often really rely on property taxes to conduct their work and their planning efforts. So, that's one example. The fiscal crisis also can lead to competition between local governments because of this fiscalization of planning. A lot of them are really focused on bringing in revenue to their communities and through sales tax. So they look for businesses or establishments that they think will bring in a lot of sales tax, and so it can create competition within the region. The high housing prices, which isn't as much of a problem now, but a couple years ago, the high housing prices really dominated a lot of the decisions that were made. And then there's the ongoing tensions around development priorities, such as, the ongoing conversation between more of a sprawled development versus compact development, and how larger community goals are realized through planning. And then lastly, property rights is an ongoing challenge. So there has been a reassertion of the rights of landowners. People don't want to be kicked off their land for development, even if it's maybe for a broader public good. They want to be able to stay on their property, especially if they've been there for generations with their families. So that causes a lot of tension, and is something that local governments really, have to think about. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kif a little bit to kind of give you an example of how all these players and all this planning comes together and looks like in a real situation with SB 375.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And Jenny's going to be on the line as well. I'd actually ask if anybody has any questions before I go into this section you want to pose to Jenny. We'd be happy to take them. And feel free to enter them in as we go. I'll keep an eye on the question section. So we wanted to give you this sort of, I guess, case study of Senate Bill 375, authored by Darrell Steinberg in 2008, or the lead author was Darrell Steinberg in 2008, known as the Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act. This is a great case study because, one, it's about climate change. Two, it involves all the layers of government. And it's both a really amazing policy and one that is fraught with the challenges that come from these different levels of government. So we're going to walk through a little bit about what SB 375 is, and I can guarantee in the course of working with local government on climate change in California, you will run into this pretty quick and pretty often. So it's useful for your work, but it's also a great illustration here. Hold on a second, I'm getting a little audio fuzz here. Let me just mute Jenny there. So the Sustainable Communities and Climate Protection Act was designed to support state climate action goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's really critical. It's about greenhouse gas reduction specifically. And when we talk about mitigation versus adaptation, this is a tension area in California today. What are their policies that do for greenhouse gas reduction versus what are the policies that help us adapt to climate change? So this is focused on greenhouse gas emissions. Through coordination of transportation and land use planning. And the goal is that the Air Resources Board, this is a state agency, will set regional targets for greenhouse gas emission reductions from passenger vehicle use. That's one element of it. So in 2010, ARB established targets for 2020 and 2035 for each region covered by one of the state's metropolitan planning organizations that Jenny was just talking about. ARB periodically reviews and updates these targets. Each of California's MPOs must then prepare a sustainable community strategy, or an SCS, as it's known, as an integral part of its regional transportation plan, the RTP. So this is an added document requirement into the regional transportation plan that all regions already put together. The SCS contains land use, housing, and transportation strategies. And this is really critical. Land use, housing, and transportation strategies all combined for the first time. That, if implemented, would allow the region to meet its greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. Once adopted by the MPO, the RTP SCS guides the transportation policies and investments for the region. So this is an effort to create an overarching umbrella set of goals and have it all. Oh, somebody says we lost audio KIF. It's good that we look at these things periodically. We missed everything. Julie, you're so awesome. You're giving us such great blow by blow here. I appreciate it. This is Julie Allingham in the Bay Area, who is Google texting us live as we go and keeping us on our toes. So really appreciate it. So everything since you started talking about ARB. Okay. So let me see where I go back to. ARB is the Air Resources Board, and they're the agency tasked with setting regional targets for greenhouse gas emissions from passenger vehicle use. So in 2010, ARB established these targets for 2020 and 2035 for each region covered by an MPO, a metropolitan planning organization. These will be periodically updated, but they're setting targets for each region. So an overall greenhouse gas reduction target. And it might have cut out when I said this, but this is only focused on greenhouse gas reductions, not adaptation. And that's an important tension that goes on in California right now as we start dealing with climate change. What's focused on mitigation and what's focused on adaptation. Each of California's MPOs must prepare what's called a Sustainable Communities Strategy, an SCS, as part of its Regional Transportation Plan, or RTP. This contains land use, housing, and transportation strategies, and that's what's innovative, unique, and incredibly challenging about about AB 375. I'm seeing a note from Larry up in the Redwood Coast that audio dropped out again. I'm hoping that that's an older question. If somebody could ping me on the Google chat that we have audio, that would be great. Julie, thank you. So I'll keep going. And so once adopted by the MPO, this RTP embedded sustainable community strategy guides transportation policies and investments for the region. So you're setting an overall infrastructure in which you have certain targets and you need to hit those targets, and then the SCS lays out the strategy for doing that. MPOs, the ARB reviews and accepts these SCSs, and then accepts the MPO determination that the SCS, if implemented, would meet regional greenhouse gas reduction targets. And so that's the overall goal and structure of SB 375. And there's a lot of acronyms in there, but SCS, as somebody's asking me, is Sustainable Community Strategy, that is folded into the Regional Transportation Plan, or RTP. What's important to get a sense of right from the get-go is you've got ARB involved, you've got the MPOs involved, and because of that local land use authority, you've got local governments involved, and they're all talking about how do we deal with housing and transportation and land use, three things that have kind of been handled independently up until now, all at once. So really necessary in order to meet regional goals, you need to have regional strategies that start to bring these things together, because if you plan housing separate from transportation, then you have to have transportation that meets it, and those things can conflict with each other. So the main elements, as I went over, were the setting of the regional greenhouse gas reduction targets, requiring the sustainable community strategy to be developed by the MPO, allocation of emissions reductions across the region. That means that there are shares assigned to different areas. Transportation funding allocation needs to be consistent with the SCS. And that means that if you're going to spend money, it has to support these regional goals. And one of the big hooks behind SB 375 is that it creates a huge streamlining incentive for consistent projects under the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. So what that says is if you're doing development and it's consistent with the SCS, you're going to get a much faster review. You can tier, it's called, tier off of the SCS so that you don't have to do a full CEQA process. And for developers and for local communities, getting projects and development happening in time is really important. And so this streamlining incentive is a real carrot for local governments. They don't have to be consistent, but ideally they will be. So this aligns our housing and transportation goals, and it also is trying to strengthen local public official input requirements, meaning that we're trying to get local stakeholders involved in the design of these things. So you can see that SB 375 as a model piece of climate change legislation pretty much involves everybody. From the state, California Air Resources Board, MPOs, local governments, and the public, because these projects and these allocations trickle down to very local communities. I can tell you anecdotally, my neighborhood, I live in north of San Rafael, in a place called Marinwood. It's very suburban. I wish there was more public access to transportation, but that's where I happen to live. And we had a big fight over our allocation of housing, affordable housing. That came about through the SCS process. And a supervisor pretty much lost their seat over this conflict. So it gets very local, and it can get very ugly because we're all trying to figure out how we can live better and divvy up this share of challenging greenhouse gas reductions. I've also included the federal government in there because their role in setting overall transportation funding, overall policy, has an impact on what we can do. For example, changes in the fuel standards in cars is going to affect our achievement of these goals at the local level. So I think you can see that this is a very complicated and rich space to be working in for a policy. So another way of looking at that flow of relationships is to describe how these pieces get set up. So for example, we define the thresholds and emissions goals for the region at the air district level. They set the criteria for tiering off of the SCS to get those incentives through CEQA. And then the MPO might set the target priority development areas. They're going to lay out the actual strategy for getting in there. And when I distinguish between the air district, I'm not talking about Air Resources Board, but a regional air district like in the Bay Area, it's the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. They have a role that is different from the Metropolitan Transportation Authority or the Association of Bay Area Governments. And they all have to kind of figure it out together because they have different responsibilities at the level of defining the strategies and the thresholds and the approaches. But then the local governments are going to be developing general plans, as Jenny talked about, and special plans that relate to that CSC and that might integrate these priority development areas into planning. And they need to balance these regional targets with their local needs. Again, going back to that story of my region, there was the biggest fight was over the fact that our schools were going to get an influx of students, but no new money. And so that was really a tension between the desire to have more affordable housing, to have more opportunities for transit-oriented development, and possible impacts on the school district. And of course, at the regional level, they can't get into all those fights. And so it ends up sort of flowing down to the local and the public who weigh in and fight back. And as I said, somebody lost their seat as an elected official pretty much over this fight. So you can see how that then flows back on up to the MPOs and the air districts, etc. So I'm getting a question around an explanation of CEQA, or the California Environmental Quality Act. CEQA is a statute, and I'm using the powers of the internet here to read straight from my California Natural Resources Agency, because it's not the kind of thing I keep exactly in my head, but it is a statute that requires state and local agencies to identify the significant environmental impacts of their actions and to avoid or mitigate those impacts if feasible. And what that means is that when there is going to be a significant environmental impact from development, and that's there can be a tension over exactly when that comes into play, you've got to mitigate or reduce those impacts. The basic requirements, if it applies to a situation, are an environmental review imposes both procedural and substantive elements. At a minimum, an initial review of the project and its environmental effects must be conducted. Depending on the potential effects, a further and more substantial review may be conducted in the form of an environmental impact report, an EIR. A project may not be approved as submitted if feasible alternatives or mitigation measures are able to substantially lessen the significant environmental impacts of the project. So this is one of those areas where local governments try to avoid CEQA and environmental impact review wherever possible, because it can be lengthy, it can be costly, and it can be challenging for the certainty of a project going forward. And if you're trying to get a new business in your community, if you're trying to get some housing built or a road fixed, having to go through this process and the possibilities of not getting it approved can be really challenging. So but that's the stick in some ways of California environmental policies, and it's been very powerful, but it is not without its foes. So all of this to us here in CivicSpark, in the Local Government Commission, is why local government matters. These tensions and opportunities between something as sort of noble and important as SB 375, an attempt to sort of design holistically a response that allows local communities to deal with climate change, that tries to bring us all together to come up with a common solution at a regional scale, and the very messy realities of enacting that. This is why local government matters, because done right, we can do amazing things. We can build beautiful communities. We can create healthy and safe places for our children to grow up and play. We can innovate and deploy incredible technological advances that improve our quality of life. And we do this through a pretty amazing local government process. So now I want to spend a little moment talking about the Local Government Commission. Jenny gave you a great overview of local government. What is it? How does it work? What are some of the pieces? And where does this take us? I gave you a case study of SB 375 and all the sort of conflicting and overlapping responsibilities that come to play to help us reach a certain goal. But and that sort of leads right into what I think is our story as the local government commission. So as the program operator of CivicSpark, we want to tell you about who we are, what we do, and who we serve. So the local government commission, as you can see on this slide, is a nonprofit that fosters innovation in local environmental sustainability, economic prosperity, and social equity. And as you see in the words around the circle, we do that in a number of different ways. We work on designing healthy communities, on promoting energy solutions, and on responding to climate change. So we have staff members who work on these issue areas and work in particular strategies as well as particular topics. So we do water, we do health, we do energy, we do climate. We also do community design work. We do charrettes. We do information sharing to empower local governments. We also do networking to build up communities of folks. We were established in 1980 by the state to promote energy conservation and solar renewable power at the local level. This was when Jerry Brown was governor the first time around. He created a commission. And I won't bother you with the name because it was a rather unwieldy, governmenty sounding name. But when he left office, his successor did not want to sustain this as a government commission. But the group of people who'd been involved were so excited by the ability to come together, to talk, to share, that they decided to to sustain that momentum and formed a nonprofit. And the goal of that nonprofit was to constantly bring together and empower local elected officials, particularly around these issues. We've been on the forefront of the smart growth movement and linking land use decisions to health, water, climate change, and fiscal prosperity since the beginning. We have been involved in what you may be familiar with is the new urbanist movement and smart growth movement through a number of publications. We've created something called the Awani Principles, which are principles of smart growth. There's also Awani Water Principles, Awani Energy Principles, but it's the Awani Smart Growth Principles that have been most notable and I think most far-reaching that set out some guidelines for healthy and prosperous communities. We are primarily focused in California, but we do have a national reach. I would say the biggest piece of that is through our national New Partners for Smart Growth Conference, which, as I understand it, is the largest smart growth conference in the country. We bring together about 1,400 people a year to talk about smart growth issues and the many ways that community design and urban design can affect the well-being and prosperity of our people. And it's a great program. We'll be in Baltimore this year. We were in Denver last year. And it's always a fantastic opportunity to learn from a lot of really amazing people around the country. And fundamentally, we feel that local government has the best position to advance public policy and create change because this is where things happen and where it's most responsive to people. So another way of describing that is what we do and how we do it. And we help transform communities through inspiration, through practical hands-on assistance, through networking the visionary local leaders with other community leaders to both recognize their successes, amplify it, share it, and hopefully transfer that to others. We do it through workshops, participatory planning and design work, policy development assistance, tours, networking events, and conferences. And so I hope you can see from this how CivicSpark fits into both who LGC is, what we do, and how we do it. So just to give you a sense of our scale, we have a network of about 900 plus members nationwide. By far, the majority of them are in California, and we provide them with access to best practices, a peer network, thought leaders through conferences and meetings, and local, regional, and statewide national events. And one of the things that excites us about CivicSpark as a program is we now have essentially 9 field offices where you are going to engage with local governments and help to really build, support, and strengthen capacity in those regions. And they can engage with CivicSpark and have a more hands-on intersection with the kinds of ideas and initiatives that we promote and work on around the state and around the country. Just to give you another picture of LGC and who we are, these are our board members. And I put this up here because LGC, in my experience, and I worked in another nonprofit before this and have been involved and known a lot of nonprofits. Our nonprofit, by mission, are only elected officials. And so you can see the range of locations and titles up here for who we work with. And these folks are all leading elected officials from around the state who are engaged with environmental issues, sustainability issues, public health issues, and have been out front on these for many, many years. And I hope you see that there's folks in here from communities nearby where you're working, where you may be from, and it's really one of the stories we like to tell is how LGC is able to create and support this network all over California and in fact the nation. So the last slide that I want to leave you with, because it's going to tie into some of the things that we talk about over the next few days, is our theory of change. We're big on sort of models, approaches, practices, best practices, and so we have a theory of change. How do we make a difference? It's something that's embedded into CivicSpark and it's embedded into LGC, and there's some parallels that you'll see over the next few days. So we foster a network of local innovators by supporting this network of the folks who are at the cutting edge, that are creating the innovative models, that are trying new things out. We're giving them more space and opportunity. We're building their capacity to make change. And then we encourage early adoption by distributing these success stories through the conferences, workshops, newsletters, so that we create a greater level of adoption of these innovative policies and projects. So by sharing the successful work that these innovators that we've helped them and nurtured them through, we get greater adoption. We move more people into that adoption space. And then we support implementation through technical assistance so that those innovative models hit the ground and can show success. And then we work to demonstrate that these policies can be more broad-based change making at a wider scale. And then we look to the next level of innovation. And an example of that, I would say, is in the climate change space, where for the last decade throughout California, climate action plans and climate action planning has been maturing as a practice. And the number of folks and local governments who've been out front on this has grown to the point at which it's not, I would not say standard practice, but pretty getting close there. And whereas now adaptation is the issue that we're needing to turn our attention to. And in order to do that, we need to start looking at who are the leaders in that space and how can we encourage early adoption in that space. And so you'll see how LGC evolves and iterates that theory of change. And we hope that CivicSpark folds nicely into that, and we believe it will. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jenny, who's going to give you one story of the folks that we serve. Oops. Sorry, Jenny, give me a second here. I'm not. Why are you not coming unmuted? Oh, this is not going to be fair. We'll get it all sorted out. So I'll tell Mary's story for us. So Mary Jane is a supervisor, a county supervisor, and one of the things about elected officials that I started to say is that we only see them really in the public eye occasionally, mostly at a council meeting. And if any of you have ever been to a city council or county council type meeting, they can be pretty dry affairs for large part. They sit up there, they go through their very formal process. There's usually somebody who has an issue with something getting cranky during the public comment period, and they may or may not agree with what's been going on. But it can seem uninteresting. But it's an immense amount of work. So this is a picture of Mary at 4 o'clock in the morning, starting her day. She's headed out because she works in her family's restaurant. Many public officials do not do this full time. Jenny says she's unmuted. Jenny, would you like to take over? Nope. She's not unmuted. So they have a full-time job and they do this on the side, and it's an immense amount of work. So here she is baking a biscuit at her family's restaurant because she's got to do this while she also has to attend various meetings. Now, local government officials do not just go to council meetings. They don't just get handed a packet of information. once a month or whatever it is to go to their main meeting. They attend a lot of different committees and a lot of different groups and a lot of different community events. And so this is her at the SACOG, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments Transportation Committee meeting. So then she heads out to discuss health policies at a local high school. Then she's off to talk about a gym and library for another high school. And then she's doing a staff update on land use and maintenance issues until finally she gets to an evening meeting in Yuba. This is the county where she works, on the transit service. And I don't know how many of you have been to local government meetings, but they often start at 6 o'clock, maybe 7 o'clock at night, and they can go till 1, 2, or 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, if you remember, Mary Jane, she gets up at 4 o'clock in the morning. So she's doing this over and over again because she feels strongly about her community and because she's trying to make change. And so we just wanted to give you that picture of a person because there are always real people on the other side of these issues. And we'll talk at another training, and we'll talk, I hope, over the course of the year about the people that we deal with and how if you understand those people, it makes our job a lot easier because we approach them recognizing their constraints, their barriers, and the challenges they're operating with. So with that, we're going to turn over to each of the regions for an activity. And in this activity, you're going to spend some time. It looks like we have about half an hour to do some research on your region. We want you to look at who are the local governments in your region. How many cities are there? What kind of cities? Are there special districts or JPAs? What do they do? Can you try and create a little bit of a map of the region? What do they look like as far as how do, going on their websites, if you look at their websites and you see how do they present their story? How do they explain their work? How do they organize their information for their constituents, their citizens, or their clients and customers, if it's more of a sewer district? And then what kind of innovative measures are they taking, particularly around climate change? Do they have a green page? Is there a climate action page? What can you find out about what they're doing already? What department is responsible for climate action work? Is it happening at the city manager's office, or is it happening in environmental services or public works? Do you know, is there an SCS for the region? What's the status? What's included? What's not? We don't expect you to answer all of these questions, but you can use these as a guide to look around and see what you can find out and share it with each other about your region. So enjoy. We'll check back in a half an hour. Oh, and well, in a half an hour, you'll have a break for 15 minutes, and then Kristen will be back at 2:45 for policies and procedures that'll take us to 4:15, and we'll be done for the day, which is an incredible thing. So enjoy this next activity, and Kristen will see you in a little bit, and I will be back online tomorrow.